Hello, everyone. Takuya here.
And I'm Gabby.
And welcome back to the podcast, my hoes. Welcome back to, well, I'm actually going to be saying welcome back for anyone that's visually watching us right now on YouTube. Because, Gabby, how long has it been since we did an episode that was on YouTube?
I think we stopped around December, January somewhere because we just could not get the lighting right. And then the videos were not getting the views at that time. So we were like, hey, this is a lot of work.
It's affecting everything. It's either an 8-minute video or it's an hour-long video, and people did not know what it is that they were doing. But hey, now since the videos on the channel are longer, it kind of all fits together, to be honest.
So we'll see how this goes. Anyway, before we get into today's episode, I just want to remind everyone that we only have 9 spots left for the Italy trip next year. So if you do want to go on that trip with us, make sure to, sign up. The link's in the description.
Yep. And by all means, we are going to be having another announcement later on this month because we're recording this right now at the beginning of September, that there is going to be another trip. But even if you've seen some of the little teasers or details that we have dropped, the full announcement of that is going to be announced at the end of September.
It's Peru.
Yeah, it's basically Peru. But the actual details of the trip and everything that we're doing, those are going to be released. I guess we can go ahead and just say it right now. So if you haven't signed up for the email or for anything, by all means, check that out. And also, before we begin, and last ad in here, I promise, make sure to check out our coffee because we have a bundle currently going on right now with Aiden Mathis and the Lore Lodge. And if you go and get our coffee bundle and you say that you came from Stakui, we have a competition?
Yeah, basically, we're going to pick like one person to give away a bundle of their both coffees and the mugs. I think, no,
well, everyone is getting it,
coffees.
But they get extra stuff for it.
Yeah, they get extra coffees. So
exactly. But speaking of getting extra and stuff for free, communism.
That was not the segue you wanted it to be.
No, it's not accurate, in the first place. And it's probably a horrible job that I did right there in the first place doing that.
But today we're going to be talking about Fidel Castro and the many. Do you think I say enough manys?
No.
Okay, the many assassination attempts on him. And they all failed, right? Didn't he die of natural causes?
Yeah.
What?
Oh, yeah.
Okay,
in fact, I still remember in the mid 2010s, and you actually see him up there, and he still looks the same. How do I even put this? On TikTok where there's the age filter, right? And it just makes it look kind of like you, but it draws a bunch of lines and stuff on your face.
That was not my experience with that filter, so.
Okay, well, that's pretty much what ended up happening to him. It's kind of crazy how it is that he looks there at that time. But either way, what we are talking about today, guys, is the story of Cuba, the story of Fidel Castro, the story of all of it. Because truthfully, the story of Cuba really cannot be told without the story of Fidel Castro, and you can't tell the story of Fidel Castro without Cuba. They are intertwined, as he has been easily one of the most important aspects to the history of that nation, really since it became a nation. That's absolutely true. It's in the same way that you can't talk about a lot of Latin American countries without talking about Simón Bolívar, which we also did an episode on. If you haven't seen that, well, I say see that, listen to it, because
Patreon exclusive though. Sorry.
Oh shoot, you're right. It was. We did do that. Yeah, that's my mistake. Either way, if you all want to join Patreon, that's only it's $1 a month. That's it. Because I like to be able to teach people without bleeding them dry of money. Either way, his story is extremely important, and to understand why this is so important and why they're so intrinsically linked, that's what we're going to be covering here today with one of my favorite aspects of history, the thing that I love talking about more than anything else, rather than getting to the point on anything. You know what that is, Gabby?
Context.
Context. Exactly. Context. Oh my God. I have so many tangents on so many things every time we cover it, just talking about historical context and background. That's what I love, people. I love intertwining and connect. That's not even the right word. What is the word? I love how everything is intertwined and connected. That's what I love. Exactly. So if we are going back in history in what could normally be described as a massive flaw in anything that I'm already talking about today in our script, we're going to be talking about things just after the Spanish-American War and the story of Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders that are charging up San Juan Hill, which that is its own badass story that is, I would just really love to cover. And you may wonder, okay, well, why? Why are we starting at that point? Why are we not starting with Cuba itself? Well, because screw you all, Teddy Roosevelt is awesome and he deserves his own episode. And absolutely, he is going to be getting one. That is definitely something that has to be added to our entire repertoire of everything that we have covered in the past several years. Holy crap, the podcast is almost 2 years old at this point.
Yeah.
When did we actually start that? That was December, wasn't it?
Of 2021? November of 2021.
November. In 2 months, we will have been doing this for 2 years.
In the same garage.
That is kind of crazy. I did realize looking at the episodes that we have 100 episodes that are currently loaded onto the onto the podcast upload thing, counting the bonus episodes and everything else we put on. But still, that's crazy. Oh my God, we have been doing this for a while. Either way, the important thing that you all need to know is that this episode is going to be a little bit of a long one in the beginning, which is why we're going to be splitting this into 2 parts. And when we are talking about the island of Cuba itself, it has always up until this point been part of a larger colonial power. And not just any large colonial power. We're talking about the OG one, the preeminent colonial power of the 16th century that controlled almost everything in the Americas. Spain. You know, the thing that initially could control Trinidad for a while before the British rolled up and we were like, hey, give us your island, as you put.
Spain controlled most islands for a while.
It did.
Until everyone else was like, you can't have all of it. You got to share.
It did. The Spanish Empire was like the largest, one of the largest empires in history. And in the 16th century, it was the largest empire in the world at that time. Like it absolutely was. So here we are, going back for a little bit of context, going into the background. 1492, Christopher Columbus sails the ocean blue. I'm sorry, I had to say it. It's the rhyme. What else am I supposed to say in that scenario? We have to go back. But anyway, he, quote, discovers lands that people have already been living on for thousands of years and then proceeds to colonize all over them. He's basically just showing up on the island and being like, hey, I heard you all like colonization. So guess what? We're going to do all of that and we're going to colonize everything. Though in this case, he's primarily utilizing people that he swears until his dying day are Indians, like he is in the Indies. He is not in anything that's a new continent. No, again, yeah, everyone else was already aware that he had discovered a new series of lands, right, with the Americas. But until his dying breath, he firmly believed that he had discovered India.
You're joking.
No, he did. And there's a key reason as to why. Maps at that time, we give him a lot of shit now. But it's somewhat understandable as to why he would have thought that, because their knowledge of the Indies at the time, like in Indonesia and all this, is that they knew, okay, next to India and Japan, right, and China, there is a massive series of islands. Thousands of different islands that are tropical and with all these different people.
So he found the islands.
So he thought he found one of the outskirt islands of Indonesia.
Okay, fine.
Like, see, it's somewhat understandable when you look at it like that, even though the math doesn't actually math at that point. Like, he was way off, but he thought that the distance was shorter than it actually was. The audacity to go and then subjugate an entire civilization and bend them to your will without caring at all for human suffering is, I mean, it's truly incredible by today's standards, to be fair. But back in the day, this was a typical Tuesday for Columbus because he cared about one thing and one thing only. Or I guess 2 things. 1, being right. And then 2, getting cash. That was the big thing. And for the longest time here, like he began centuries upon centuries of long enslavement and subjugation for the entire islands, for these communities, for these regions. The Cubans wasted no time in trying to shake off their colonial masters because the first violent resistance or revolt or rebellion in Cuban history ended up occurring all the way back in 1512 when there was an indigenous tribal leader by the name of Hatui who ended up being burned at the stake for organizing rebellion.
So they really burned people at the stake.
Oh, God, yeah. Yeah, that was a thing that was done for centuries.
Well, I know that, these Salem witch trials, but come on.
Yeah. And Hatui was a Taino cacique. I believe I'm saying that name correctly, which the name for that translates to chief. And in a speech that was calling out to all of the Spanish and their evil doing in the region for the native perspective, which considering their modern perspective is also something that we would still look at as rather evil. He called upon all the Taino chiefs in Cuba and Hispaniola in order to drive out the Spanish out of the islands. It didn't work. Now, the thing is, when we were talking about tribal politics, everyone is very divided. And typically speaking, on a place with many different islands that are constantly competing with one another over resources and fighting over territory, yeah, they didn't care. They didn't care. So the majority of the chiefs did not end up answering his call for the most part. And so he and his tribe had to resort to guerrilla warfare tactics in order to fight the Spanish, which didn't work. It worked for a time. Like, obviously, they can do some damage, but eventually he gets caught and sentenced to death and gets burned alive at the stake for his crimes. But before the fires could reach him, a priest asked Hatui if he wanted to accept Jesus and go to heaven. And historians would later note the reaction of the chief as such. Hatui, thinking a little, asked the religious man if the Spanish went to heaven. The religious man said, yes, of course, because, the Spanish are good Christian people. And then the chief said, without any further thought, that no, he doesn't want to go there. He wants to go to hell, because at least if he goes to hell, that means he's not going to be seeing the Spanish.
Valid. Okay.
Yeah. So as you can see here, Hatui was a bit of one of the OG Chads, just responding back with, nah, screw you, I'm going to hell, and is the guy who would be dubbed as Cuba's first hero. This is the person that would be the standard that would be followed by later generations and would be hearkened back to as one of the original people to inspire revolution. And so various slave revolts and rebellions would irregularly, over time, end up popping up on different parts of the island. And this is something that would not stop until going into the 1800s. And when I say 1800s, I mean the late, end? Like the end, as in, what was 1886? Yeah.
Like literally the 1800s. The end of the
1800s. Yeah. In fact, I'm actually wondering right now, technically, slavery is banned, obviously. What is the last state on earth to ban slavery? I'm genuinely curious about that. I know Brazil was pretty late in the game because they didn't. I think Brazil did it in the 1890s, if I recall correctly. I'm trying to wonder that now. You're looking it up?
Our editor, James, wrote this episode. So Steve is just listing off a bunch of stuff. And this episode is 29 pages long?
It's 29 pages long in terms of notes and everything.
If he included everything that you want to know, it would have been like 10 years of podcast.
Oh, absolutely. And that's the thing. We not only have the notes of everything that we're talking about with the story, but simultaneously, I will be jumping off at any number of random points for tangents because I'll have a thought and then it will make me think, hey, we need to figure this out real quick.
In 1981, Mauritania became the last country in the world to abolish slavery.
1981?
So, slavery is technically illegal after being criminalized for the first time in 2007 and again in 2015. The abolition is rarely enforced.
Mauritania.
That's what it says.
Yeah, that's in Mauritania is in Northern Africa. It was oh my God. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense actually for the region because that was a huge territory for slave trade.
Apparently, it was hereditary racial slavery, similar to the slavery system that existed in the U.S. prior to the Civil War. It's still widespread in the West African nation of Mauritania.
Yep, firmly believe it. And even to this day, and I don't know if this
is abolished, but it's rarely enforced.
That is actually a lot of cases across North Africa because that was one of the biggest locations for the slave trade, going back with like the Arab slave trade and what they were doing. I think something along the lines of 1.5 million Europeans were captured over the centuries and turned into slaves in there, where the males would be used as rowers, which the average life expectancy of that was almost like a salt mine. You basically died within 1 to 5 years. That was it. And then the females were sold as concubines and sex slaves, typically. Yeah. Fun times in history. History is grand, isn't it? And by that, I mean, no, it's not. That's the history of the world. It's a very brutal thing overall. But yeah, North Africa, huge for that kind of thing. And so that really surprises me, though, with Mauritania.
Okay, now back to Cuba.
Either way, back to Cuba. Exactly. The Cubans, as I said, they wanted independence. It didn't matter that slavery was a done thing. They were not going to be satisfied until they had achieved their independence. And in 1895, you have the Cuban War for Independence, which then begins. And at this point, you have two really big and important figures to remember from this time that directly have to do with Castro and his life's motivations for the rest of the story that we're going to be talking about. The first would be Antonio Maceo, who is a very humble farmer and an entrepreneur turned soldier. He is a general, and he is a mastermind of guerrilla warfare and small-scale military tactics. And so after being wounded multiple times in battle, yet surviving each time, which considering medical technology at the time is genuinely a very impressive thing that would even happen in the first place, Maceo would come to be known to the Cubans as El Titan or Titan. Would it just be Titan? How would I actually say that?
I think so.
Titan?
El Titan de Bronce.
El Titan de Bronce, or the Bronze Titan. Bronze. Yeah. So he'd be known as the Bronze Titan, which I have to say as a name. Oh my God, that is awesome. The Spanish didn't even give him a bad name themselves. The Spanish would call him El León Mayor, the Great Lion. Or I guess the Greater Lion.
That name's kind of cooler though, like Lion.
Yeah, but are you kidding me? The Bronze Titan? I kid you not. That sounds like a luchador name. Could you not see that with just like spray painted body bronze and a mask that looks like
But sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but the
Colossus
Spanish gave him a really good name, but wasn't he just fighting them the whole time?
Oh yeah, no, he was fighting them the entire time. He was good. Normally, in that case, when they're still very effective, they're given something that's associated with like a devil because it's something that is scary or feared, but still bad. In their case, no, this dude is a lion. He was such a constant threat and a thorn in the side of Spain that he spent the better part of 30 frickin' years fighting them, with only one period of peace in that time that barely lasted 5 years. That's it. The other important figure that we're going to be talking about here is the man who would arguably be called the ideological and spiritual father of the Cuban people up to the time of Castro. And his name was Jose Marti. It's almost impossible to explain just how important Jose Marti was to the Cuban people. And the closest comparison that I could probably give in that scenario is George Washington, or like what we've already covered, Simon Bolivar. Like, he was a hero. He was the Toussaint Louverture of Cuba.
That wasn't bad.
Hey, there we go. See, I'm learning from the previous episodes in which I've said anything that is French. Can you all imagine how horrible the episode is going to be when we're covering the French Revolution for me?
Oh, yeah, guys. We're going to do like a whole Patreon exclusive of the French Revolution. Multiple parts for the month of October, I think. Yes.
And we are going to release it. It's either going to be 2 or 3 episodes, depending on how long we're able to create it. But that's going to be a scenario where we release all on Patreon. And then it's going to be released gradually over the course of the month on to everything else. But it's not going to be like that one that we did on the Crusades that was super long. Either way, this guy was incredible, and he is still considered to be the father of Cuba by many. He was a patriot. He was a freedom fighter. He was a poet. He was a professor. He was a theorist. You also have to understand that what we think of as a amazing person now, like if a person was doing all this now, that is incredible. And that is very, very rare. This was more common back in the 1800s because you had a lot of people, usually of the gentlemanly class, right? Like you had the nobles, that they did a little bit of everything because they would pursue these things as passions. So you'd have the person that is a poet, archaeologist, Egyptologist, dancer, like whatever.
Egyptologist. That's
well, you know what I mean. Like they did literally everything. Well, that was kind of the point.
I've learned, and it still applies today, that if you don't have to do a 9 to 5, you can actually pursue passions, and you don't have to just do one thing forever. You could just kind of like,
it's true,
read a book. I'm a reader. Maybe I'll write a book. I'll be an author.
I would love that if you could write some of those. You already talked about writing some spicy historical fiction. So I'm going to be
a podcaster, TikToker, scientist, writer.
Yeah. Okay. No, that makes a lot of sense. Either way, this is the guy who would spread the ideology of Cuban independence through poems, through essays, through letters, novels, all of the things that you can imagine. He was creating all of this. And it sets the kind of framework up for the Cubans to discuss things like, the concept of liberty, freedom, rights, just all the stuff that you were going to be able to discuss in the streets for the first time since the Spaniards landed on the island in the first place. He is the one who would plant the seeds of revolutionary thought and freedom from bondage that have come to be a hallmark of the Cuban people since then. Though one can make a debate considering all the varying things that have gone on with Cuba since the Cuban Revolution, but it was still a hallmark of political thought that drove them to want this freedom in the first place. And the thoughts and ideals that were instilled into Cuban people by Jose Marti are as vital to their culture as arguably what we just covered in this previous week, the golden throne of the Ashanti was to the kingdom of Ashanti. It was something that was incredibly important to their very existence. And so, okay, with leadership and men like this, and with the support of the United States, Cuba was able to shake off the shackles of colonial rule in an effort to become something new. But as what would happen with any time the United States was involved in anything, going in the late 1800s into the early to mid 1900s, yeah, the United States had other plans for Cuba at this time. Which now, at this point, you're probably saying, oh, Stack, why did you just spend all this time talking about these guys? Well, because if we're going to be discussing someone like Fidel Castro, you need to understand who and where he came from and the culture and everything that influenced him to create who he is. He's not a person that would appear in his own isolated state. It's a lot easier to understand the man himself at that point. So here we go. Fidel Castro. Fidel Alejandro Castro Ruz. This is the guy who was born on August 13th, 1926, near Baran, Cuba. And so Angel Castro Iarguiz, which is, I'm probably mispronouncing that is Fidel's father. And he had immigrated from Spain and owned a relatively prosperous sugarcane farm. Like, he was not a member of the lower classes at this time. And in those days, the echoes of slavery still rang very loudly, even though nearly 40% of the Cuban population was Afro-Cuban, who were descended from the slaves. These were people that were unable to pass as European, and so their life was, typically speaking, more difficult in the society. Life remained much harder for these people, mostly comprised of the sugarcane workers and those who did not own land, who would have to work on this land of other large landowners as they could. Like, that's really all that they could do at this time. The lighter skinned Europeans, though, or people that could pass, they were typically the ones who had the land, they had the money, they had more of the opportunities. You could really think of it similar to the United States in the South during Reconstruction with like sharecroppers.
So they basically had freedom, but it was like freedom and they didn't actually have any opportunity. Yeah. So they still had to do what they were doing before. Just now they're free.
Yes. Do you remember when we covered that whole thing when we did the episode on Haiti for the Patreon exclusive? Was that Patreon exclusive or did that do that as a regular one? It was a wide
release episode.
Okay, so remember how we covered that to where immediately after the former slaves that finally got their freedom, it was a successful slave revolt, and then the new government goes, hey, we're going to need you all to go back and work on the farms. And they didn't get a choice. They were forced back onto the farms almost as slaves, but not really.
But they were free now. They could choose to go back.
No, they didn't.
Choose.
Yes,
I'm winking for people who are listening to this.
There's a gun pointed at your gut here.
I'm going to need you to go ahead and come in tomorrow
and work on that farm, buddy. Sugar is very important to our economy.
Have you been on a sugarcane plantation? Like, have you seen?
I have seen videos of them. And I've seen the reconstructions of what they used to look like, but I've never been on a proper sugarcane plantation.
Okay, I'm going to take you to one in Trinidad. It's actually interesting to visit.
I would love to honestly go and see one. So, okay, this is his father, right? He moves to Cuba and takes the place of a Spanish aristocrat in military service. He then gets out of the military. He starts a family. He becomes moderately successful running a sugarcane farm. And from there, he provides his family with a middle class, upper middle class style of wealth. Like, he is pretty well off, all things considered. He then decides to do something a little bit spicy, and he cheats on his wife with one of his servants by the name of Lina Ruz Gonzalez, whom he would later then marry.
So he divorces his wife.
Actually, I can't remember if his wife dies from something or if he just divorces her. I'm pretty sure she dies. But he has a child with this servant and then marries her. And this would be baby Fidel. And it's not only baby Fidel, but there would be 6 other children that they would end up having together, including Raul Castro, who would later become extremely important in Cuba's development. And Gabby, can you just imagine at this point, you have a baby Castro with like chubby little cheeks and this flute and like a little cap on this? You see the memes of stuff where it's like, yes, popping out of the womb straight up with a cigar and a full beard.
The original Boss Baby before the actual Boss Baby.
The original Boss Baby. So anyway, what ends up happening is that Fidel grows up, and it's very easy to tell during this time that he is quite gifted. He is a very talented student, and he's got ideas. And from a young age, his primary interest was stopping injustice. He was, for all intents and purposes, a more skilled variant of what you would see of that college student who goes in thinking that they can make a difference and change the world.
It's not exclusive to college students. Like, I'm pretty sure a huge chunk of people get into politics initially thinking they could make a difference.
Oh, I agree.
And then all of a sudden, they can't. So then they become the worst person ever.
A few moments later.
Cut that out, James. Sorry.
Got it, dude.
I agree on the note of politics, but simultaneously, this is like from a young age when you think of the teenagers and the college, like the ones who are from a young age who haven't experienced a lot of
but
stuff.
if he grew up in Cuba, and I'm assuming Cuba is like other places that were colonized.
Yes.
He probably was one of the wealthy families,
Yes.
and then he was surrounded by all the poorer families, which is a lot of us in those places. If you have any amount of money, you kind of grow up around everyone around you is not as lucky. So you just watch the worst things happen.
Oh, no, absolutely.
All the time.
Absolutely.
So you're like, I'm going to fix this because it's not fair.
And that was things for him. No, and you're right. That was things for him. Like, remember how I mentioned before that his family was upper middle class? Well, in this community, as you said, they were one of the lucky ones. He spent his early years watching all of his extended family, his servants, his friends, and all of the other people within society there struggle with poverty. He saw endless amounts of needless poverty, people who could not own property, so therefore they were less invested in the land that they worked. He saw people come to his father begging for money. And Castro would describe his relationship with his father as at arm's length at all times. There wasn't really much love between them. And because of this, we find that Castro is yet another famous world leader who happened to be a mama's boy. Because if his father kept him at arm's length, his mother spoiled him. Castro respected the hell out of his mother. She was a sugarcane farm servant in Cuba who had come from nothing and made a life out of her circumstances. He would later speak of her with respect, saying that she was basically illiterate and taught herself to read and write on her own. I never heard her say that she ever went to school. She was an extremely extraordinary, hardworking woman. I never saw her rest 1 second in a whole day. This was a woman who her entire life, she had known nothing but work, and that is exactly what she continued to do. And so interestingly enough, though, his introduction to the world of politics and injustice would come about by reading the stories of the then ongoing Spanish Civil War to his family's cook, Manuel Garcia, because this was going into the 1930s, right? And he is only 10 years old. Which I'll be honest, the Spanish Civil War going in there in 1936, that is probably something that we should do an episode on itself because that was a messy, messy ordeal. It really was. But Manuel was a grown man who was illiterate. And so what Fidel would do is he would go and read the papers, most of them having been Spanish nationalists, since those were some of the more successful ones, but also some of the leftist papers too. When I explain this of nationalist versus leftist, you have to understand that the entire thing was a massive, confusing mess. The nationalists tended to be composed of individuals that were, you had proto-fascist, you had the church, you had the military, you had all the other more pillars of society, the monarchists, these kinds of individuals. And then on the left-wing side, you had just like democratic liberals. But then you had that mixed with anarcho-communist and like Stalinist communists. And it was a whole mess of things that ended up fighting each other more than they ended up fighting the nationalists. And that's one of the key things that divided them that ended up leading the nationalists to winning, is that they spent so much time fighting amongst themselves. But either way, he read from all these varieties of papers, and he would read them to Garcia for hours while he cooked. And as he was doing this, he begins to form his own ideas about various complex topics, things like, equality, about liberty, law, order, and most importantly, his sense of justice. And it's around this time that his parents decide to place him in a Catholic school in the hopes that, he's going to get a better education there. And to be honest, they did succeed. Just not, in this case, in the way that he expected. See, Castro later would recall how one of the teachers went on a honeymoon to Niagara Falls and then came back bragging to the children who had no concept of what a vacation was, like at all, right? And so Castro, even at 10 years old, saw this and went, hey, that's stupid. Why do you get to do all this and none of us get to? This is someone in a position of privilege who is not recognizing the struggle of other people and being completely tone deaf to the plight of those people that were struggling. So what he ended up doing is that he organized a group of young boys with slingshots made from guava tree branches and strips of rubber, hid in the trees and foliage around her home, and then would launch a continuous volley of little rocks up in the air and down on top of the metal roof of the teacher's home. And so for an hour and a half, the sound of a steady rain bombarded her roof, and it drove this teacher basically a little nutty, and she never found out who was the mastermind of the plan. Like, this was the kind of crap that he was doing from a very young age. Just of, hey, this person is in a position of privilege and doesn't understand anything. Screw you. Screw you, buddy. And so recalling that story nearly 50 years later, he has this huge stupid grin on his face, and he says, by the time one rock hit the roof, another 2 or 3 were about to hit right behind it. We were very accurate and planned for a constant rain of rocks. Oh, we were vengeful little devils.
I mean, yeah.
Yep.
He really was like a revolutionary from a young age. You could definitely see where it was heading.
Oh, yeah. And it's not even the craziest thing that little Castro is going to do either. No. At one point when he was 11 years old, right, his parents decide that they're going to remove him and his brothers from school after Fidel kind of assaulted the principal. Or the vice principal.
They decided to remove him from school, or he got expelled?
Yeah, they were wealthy enough that, could have him voluntarily remove, if you will. So, yeah, as his story goes, there was this guy called Brother Bernardo, who was the school's vice principal. And he apparently played favorites when it came to the students. And Fidel was caught arguing or fighting with one of Bernardo's favorite students. And when he discovered the boys, Bernardo, for a better lack of the term, slapped the shit out of him. And he's an 11-year-old.
I mean, if you've been to school in the Caribbean.
Catholic school at this time in the Caribbean, absolutely.
No, just any school. Bro, when I went to school, they used to hit us. It's perfect. It was perfect. I don't know if it still is. I haven't been to school there in like years, but it's perfectly acceptable.
Oh, yeah. And then not too much later, guess what? What? Happens again. Apparently, later on, Fidel would speak out of turn while waiting in line, and Bernardo then goes, slaps him again.
For speaking out of turn?
Yep. Harder than the first time. Then, a few weeks later, Fidel's arguing with some classmates about who would get to be first at bat in a schoolyard game of baseball, and suddenly, with no warning at all, he is struck on the side of the head from behind. Bernardo was kind of a bit of an asshole that had it out specifically for him. He seemed to like hitting kids. He seemed to think that, discipline, like that was the best thing that he could do for them. And that third strike is all that it took to just set Fidel off. He lost his shit. And even as an 11-year-old, he is assaulting this fully grown man. Castro would later describe it as, that was the last time. And I just kind of blew up. I took the buttered rolls in my pocket. I threw them in his face as hard as I could. Then I ran at him and jumped on him like a little tiger, biting him, kicking him, hitting him with my fists in front of the entire school. I was a student and he was a figure of authority who had humiliated a student.
I love the buttered rolls in his pockets. Just keeping them for lunch?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. You just, keep your food there. This is what you would do. You had to. Yeah, definitely. So back to the conversation with Castro and his parents. They're threatening to not send him back to school. So what does our young revolutionary then do? He threatens his parents. He threatens to burn down their entire damn house if he takes away his right to an education. And he would word it as literally defending my right in his recollection of the events some 40 years later, which is an interesting thing to note because that was a firm belief that he had then, that everyone would have a right to education. It's a very key and important part. This is actually one of the things that people talk about Cuba for what he did specifically regarding literacy later on. Education was supremely important. And his threat was not simply just a child getting his way. That was the first act, arguably, of what he had towards fighting what he saw as a grand injustice. Really impressive, actually.
I mean, it is, but burning the house down a little bit.
Yeah, but imagine a day and age like today, a kid threatening to burn down their own house, like to their parents, if they didn't allow them to go to school.
Military school. They'd go to military school.
Even that he would have considered. That was still something that would have been better, right? So either way, shortly after, Fidel is 14 years old. This is one of the more interesting correspondences in history when there is, of course, our young Fidel Castro, and he writes a letter to Franklin D. Roosevelt, the president of the United States at the time. And the contents of the letter are as such. We have it written out here. From Santiago de Cuba, November 6th, 1940. Mr. Franklin Roosevelt, President of the United States. My good friend Roosevelt. I don't know very English, But I know as much as write to you. I like to hear the radio, and I am very happy because I heard in it that you will be president for a new period. I am 14 years old. I am a boy, but I think very much, but I do not think I am writing to the president of the United States. If you like, give me a $10 green bill American in the letter, because never I have not seen a $10 bill green American and would like to have one of them.
I get what he was saying. I hope he got his $10 bill.
My address is SR Fidel Castro, Colegio de Dolores, Santiago de Cuba, Oriente, Cuba. P.S. I don't know very English, but I know very much Spanish. And I suppose you don't know very Spanish, but you know very English because you are American, but I am not American. It's just going in circles at this point. Thank you very much. Goodbye, your friend, F. Castro. Signed, Fidel Castro. P.S. If you want iron to make ships, and I show you the biggest of iron in the land, they are in Mayor Oriente, Cuba.
He literally said, come take our iron, bro. It's free. Yeah. Not free, but he really was like, let's go. I'll take you there.
Years later, he would tell a reporter who was interviewing him in 1975 that he did, in fact, receive a correspondence from the White House that was thanking him for the letter, but he never did receive the $10 bill.
That's rude. That's rude.
It was said jokingly many years later that FDR could have potentially saved America a lot of trouble if they had just sent the kid $10. That would have been like a really positive thing to make him look upon America with really good light. Either way.
You heard it here, folks. Goes. Send $10 bills.
Just send it to a random Cuban kid their request somewhere. Or no, any kid all over the world. You never know who's going to rise up and be the next one.
Send it to me. I don't know. I'm a 28-year-old teenage girl.
No, we've seen our daughter. Send it to our daughter, because if anything, she has threatened the world with world conquest multiple times in all of her games. Yeah, she has. Either way, after this, he is sent to be taught by the Jesuit priests who are much better at handling this very lively boy. And he spends the next few years breezing by through school. And when he gets to high school, he was pretty popular. He was quite well known at this time amongst the students. And it didn't hurt that at the time he was 16 years old and he looked, I'm going to say the word good. He's described as being like Timothée Chalamet. I don't know. I'm going to pull it up right now so that we can see this.
Baby, do you know who that is? Like Timothy, the actor?
No. Or Chalamet. Chalamet is what I was supposed to say there. I think I said Chalamet.
You never quite get the words right.
No, and especially not when it comes to different actors or other people. I really don't. Either way, when he would later recall his young life as a rebellious student, he would say, I was a dreadful, terrible example as a student because I never went to class. In high school, I never attended a lesson. At university, I never went to class either. What I do was talk to the other students in the park, and I'd just talk out there. There were small benches with the guys, and especially with the girls, because they would pay a little bit more attention to me. They were better educated.
Wow.
So yes. You wonder at this point, how the hell did he even manage to graduate if he never attended any of his classes? Well, he would do what any proper high schooler or college student does who doesn't study at all. He would wait till the last second. See, he was a voracious reader. He would read all the different subjects of all the varying things that they were supposed to be covering, and then he would cram the night before the exams. And then because he was so naturally talented, as a lot of people end up suffering from success when this happens, at least when it comes to testing, his grades were remarkably high for someone who literally on most of his days could not be bothered to even attend class or do anything. But he did. And this is another moment where if one pays attention, right, we can notice him acquiring a lot of skills for later in life. He is planning for future events already because what he's doing is he's improving his ability to debate socially and convince others to go along with this plan. His big thing was specifically speaking to people. And it's then that Castro, as a young, handsome college student, begins to enter the world of politics. He goes and enters a bunch of student organizations at the time. And what we should note here is that in Cuba at the time, student organizations have an incredible amount of political power and sway. This is a time where it's not like today's day and age where you see people that are, the student council or other stuff where, when you're like seeing anime and you see.
No, if they mean like student council.
No, that's
They're
only one as an
student
example.
political organizations even today,
Like
but they
young
don't
Republicans or young Democrats.
they don't
like
have
those,
much
yes.
sway. So I think that's what they're talking about, where they had more pull within
Correct.
actual government.
Correct. They did.
And I think even today, college organizations do have a decent amount of pull because you see them in the news all the time. You typically for something chaotic.
You see some of them, but that's a lot through the power of social media and dissemination. What they have at this time for how they're organizing big marches and everything that they're doing, student organizations did a lot more than what it is that they arguably do today.
They organize marches today too. I don't know if you knew that.
Maybe it's just that they had more impact. People
I think they just
generally with
had
social
more
media.
impact.
Yeah.
I think that's what it is. They took them more seriously.
Yeah, perhaps that is the case here, and I'm just messing that up. Either way, it's in these organizations, right? The Castro would go and learn how to organize people, how to spread information via pirate radio stations. He even sees his first combat training for a failed attack on the Dominican dictator at the time.
So the college organization attempted an attack on the Dominican dictator?
No. It's combat training, right?
Oh, okay.
Combat
Okay.
training, because some of these organizations, I kid you not, were almost pseudo-malicious, where it's training people. Because there was this idea for some organizations, think of like old Boy Scouts, right? Some of these older organizations would include a lot of shooting and military drills that would be great staging points for anyone that would then be entering the military later.
So it's like when the Boy Scouts say be prepared, they were just prepared for war?
Yeah, a revolution, or like, yeah, basically.
I like it.
Yeah. He would also publish his first manifesto, or a political manifesto, in secret in a newspaper called El Acusador, which
The
is
accuser.
the accuser. Exactly. Yeah. And it was during this time then in places like Venezuela that Castro would start to take part in various, not just organizations, but events. There were various rebellions. There were revolts. There were all these little uprisings that in most of these places failed. That's understandably what happens in a lot of places around the world. But he saw what would happen. He saw the poor planning. He saw the bad organization. He saw how all of this would ruin their chances at any kind of real change. And he decides at this point that capitalism was an unjust system, something that could in no way work for Cuba. And it was mostly due to the fact that while slavery had been abandoned in Cuba, life for Cubans didn't really look any different under its new capitalist society than it did under its semi-feudal society. It was pretty much the same, except the slave was replaced with the wage, and the wage was low. And so he became convinced that what Cuba needed was redistribution of wealth, because as it currently was, it was never going to allow for Cuban society, and in particular people like the Afro-Cubans, to be empowered and respected, because they were never going to be on an equal footing as he saw it. So, okay, now we need to go and take a step back here and talk about Cuba as a country now, because we talked about Fidel, but now we need, again, to go a little bit before he was actually born. So in 1923, if we're going to be setting the stage here, you have Gerardo Machado. This is an individual who goes and overthrows the government and would begin a decade-long dictatorship. In 1933, he gets overthrown by another guy, which, is usually the thing that ends up happening when it comes to dictatorships, Fulgencio Batista. And Fulgencio, or in this case, I'm going to say Batista, that's when everyone is talking about like, oh, the Cuban dictator and everything here, they're usually referring to him, right? He was a military leader with a lot of popular support at the time amongst the people. And initially, Batista would do fairly right by the Cuban people. His stated intention at the time was to bring Cuba back to a sense of normality, to reinstitute a constitution with free elections. And this took him some 7 years to actually accomplish. And by the time these elections were held, he did have the support of the Democratic Socialist Coalition, comprised of many different groups, one of which Castro was actually involved with.
I have a question, because
Yes.
we see we're pretty topical right now, because with Gabon and Niger, you have all of these coups occurring, and it's the military.
Yes.
How does the military just decide to go against the leader of the country? Is the leader of the country not the head of the military?
Yeah, he's the head. Well, typically, especially
Also,
in a
how
place
is it
like
not
this.
treason? Does everybody
is.
just back?
It is, but at that point, you have a person that is in charge and they can declare that it wasn't treason, because the person who actually committed treason was the previous person that was in charge, because they betrayed their country or betrayed their ideals or whatever. And that's why they were removed.
I think I might be too much of a rule follower to become a dictator because I'd just be like, ooh, guys, we just broke the law. Gotta turn ourselves in.
Oh, yeah? Yeah. Guess what, Gabby? Change the law. Then you can be a dictator. So, yeah, he had the support of all these different groups, one of which Castro was involved with. And again, to Batista's credit, he gets elected. Like he actually wins and he serves a few years as this president and then ends up retiring to the United States. Like his early reign is legit, if anything. And another example of how history just really appreciates a nice backside, there is a massive, massive butt. A big fat butt. A whole lot of backsliding, or I should say in this case, backsliding. Yeah. Batista had left, but he wasn't done with Cuba.
So he retired, but he still was like, I'm going to still mess with. But he didn't even retire there. You can't mess with the place you wouldn't retire in.
Yeah. So he moves to the United States, but he decides, hey, I kind of miss Cuba. I miss being in charge of something. So he is still in the US, but he remains, and again, big fat butt, but he remains heavily involved still with Cuban politics from a distance. And eventually he gets approached by the US government because he was a person with a lot of power. He was the one with arguably the most power and influence in the Cuban system that had ease of access by the United States to actually reach and could effectively change the Cuban system and be an ally to the United States. So the United States begins backing him with equipment, with support, and in 1952, Batista goes in and takes back power a few months before the legal elections are held. And the United States government, of course, immediately recognizes the legitimacy of Batista's government, causing much of the rest of the world to hesitantly do so as well, because this is the early 50s. And the US, post-World War II, is the supreme power that no one can really question at this time. Like they were just in charge, effectively.
So you said he started off strong and then it kind of...
Yeah, because he served his term. Like he did everything there as a president. It was when he came back as a dictator that it was a little bit of a problem.
A dictator who is trying to ally with the US, so he's going to be carrying out the US.
Oh, yeah. Because for lack of a better word, he whored out the country.
Oh.
Yeah.
That always goes well.
Yeah, no, it really is. Batista not only catered to American elites, mafia members, anyone that he had done business with back in the United States and those that would seek further, but he essentially set up Havana as being the Caribbean Las Vegas. It really was. Famous mafia criminals from the States could walk the streets of Havana openly with like no issues whatsoever. Politicians would take their vacation there just to get their choice of prostitutes. And when asked what it was like at the time, there was an American journalist by the name of David Detzer who would state, and I quote, brothels flourished. A major industry grew up around them. Government officials received bribes. Policemen collected protection money. Prostitutes could be standing in doorways, strolling the streets, or leaning from windows. And one report estimated that 11,500 of them worked their trade in Havana alone. Beyond the outskirts of the capital, beyond the slot of machines, was one of the poorest and most beautiful countries in the Western world. David Dietzer, American journalist, after visiting Havana in the 1950s. It was pretty crazy. It was said at the time that obtaining cocaine and marijuana here were hardly more difficult than obtaining alcohol. You could get anything that you wanted, and addiction rates spiked up and unemployment rates swelled. It was a lawless land. Or that's not actually the right word. I shouldn't say lawless. It was law that Batista said was law. Everything else didn't matter so long as you could accept a bribe. That's really how it was. And so there was another social critic and historian by the name of Arthur Schlesinger, who would say of Cuba during the reign of Batista, quote, the corruption of the government and the brutality of the police, the government's indifference to the needs of the people for education, medical care, housing, for justice and economic justice is an open invitation to revolution. Because they could see, like, okay, guys. There's very clearly a problem here. And if we don't fix it, there will be a revolution. And they're not even saying like, oh, no, the system is bad. We need to go ahead and fix it. They're saying like, hey, there's so much corruption here that if we don't actually improve this, this means that we're probably going to see something way harsher come into play and people are going to rise up.
Yeah, that's typically what happens, especially if people were really, really poor and nobody cared about it and tried to do anything. Like at some point, someone's going to be like, enough.
Yeah. Like I'm going to say this as an example. And I know everyone uses this when they're talking about politics when it comes to history. That like the Germans, Hitler, etc. Like he took power in Germany legally, initially elected like as chancellor, and then from there overthrew the government. And a lot of the stuff that he was doing in the early 30s, besides the horrible stuff that was happening to members of the Jewish community, is that he was fixing a lot of the economic infrastructure of Germany, because under the Weimar Republic, it was a broken state with all of its inflation. He actually fixed a lot of Germany's problem going into the beginning and then made everything significantly worse. I need to specify that. Made everything significantly worse after all. But when you have a lot of bad situations like that in a country that just wants something different, it opens the door to pretty much anyone being able to come in and take power.
Anyone.
And in the case of Fidel, he was ready to step in.
He's been waiting his whole life for
absolutely.
This moment.
Exactly. So after legal means failed to dislodge Batista's new dictatorship, Castro went and began to organize a rebel force for the task in 1953. He knew that he might be noticed if he was training groups in the countryside, as Batista's spies were everywhere, and they were known to go around rural areas looking for anyone that could be fermenting rebellious ideas. So what does Castro do? He trains his men how to shoot in the middle of Havana. Like he is in the capital itself. He goes to the University of Havana, right? To the shooting range, disguised as students. And like you have to think, these shooting ranges are constantly being frequented by American businessmen, and his revolutionary recruits just dressed in whatever business clothing they could muster. So they would get all these little suits, all these like anything that they needed to do, and they would be supplied with them if they could afford like to receive some help. And he would just have these people that it could be a straight up farmer who has access to literally nothing, given a suit, go to the shooting range. Oh yeah, I look like just some, sugar plantation owner or whatever. And no, we're just at the range, shooting off some bullets here. Just like no big deal, guys. Just chilling.
It's like a spy movie, like John Wick.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. There's something beautiful about the fact that he manages to do this, that they hide in plain sight and no one suspects them here because, again, they look like some well-to-do college students that are dressed as businessmen. And that's it.
I'm going to be awfully suspicious of everyone at a shooting range from here on out. So
after months of training and organization, on July 26, 1953, Castro goes and leads his forces in Santiago de Cuba, a city on the southeastern end of the island. And just by mentioning that date just now, there are some Cuban listeners, I'm sure, that are listening to this who probably just experienced this big swell of patriotism because it's this big moment. Because the 26th of July is essentially the Cuban 4th of July.
Like Independence Day?
Like Independence Day, yeah. So let me explain what it is that I mean. For any guerrilla warfare or fighting, you need to have a force that is armed sufficiently. You don't necessarily need as good of or as many weapons as the force that you're fighting because you're utilizing guerrilla tactics, but you still need something. And Castro had experienced firsthand in Venezuela in the late 1940s that things could go wrong very quickly. The rebellion that he took part in at that time was very quickly squashed due to the government having guns for every man, while many of the rebels simply had whatever it is that they could grab off the streets. And for them, that would be sticks or machetes.
They brought machetes to a gunfight?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, they would. I mean, hell, for some places that actually works, that was mostly what happened with the slaves of the Haitian revolt, right? Because you had, and this is where some of the horror stories.
Yeah, but that was earlier, right? So they didn't have as good of guns.
Oh,
this is the
different.
1940s. Their guns were much more gun-like. Sorry.
Yes. No, I know.
Not to undermine. I just, they had those old-timey ones where if it rained too hard, whoops, we can't fire. Guess we gotta flash.
No, I know exactly what you mean. Right?
I keep forgetting we're recording and my face is like, oh no.
So around this time, right, in what would become later the textbook for guerrilla warfare tactics, Castro's first objective was to amass firepower. He needed guns. And to this end, he chose the Moncada military barracks for his first target. The building housed enough weapons to arm hundreds of people, if not thousands of different revolutionaries. And so Castro, in his late 20s, this is where he comes in and becomes a brilliant leader. He just doesn't have enough experience at this point to properly plan a successful attack. We have to remember that he is arming and training the working lower classes. He essentially is trying to get these people to be soldiers when he has never been one himself.
He trained in college.
Yeah.
It's basically professional military training.
No, he knew how to shoot, but he didn't have the military training for all this. So the plan was to secure the barracks and then from there gain possession of the weapons that were stored inside of it and to use the building's army communications equipment to spread false messages for several hours to try and confuse the military. And then while that was happening, the weapons could be removed and hidden around the city. And Castro knew that it was a military installation, but he chose the 26th of July as there were local festivals that were occurring at the time, which would make it easier for him to move his men around unnoticed. So they seriously, at this time, were using what you could call the Assassin's Creed tactics of just blending in with groups in the public to disappear. For anyone who played any of the earlier games, which admittedly I haven't played many of the later games, back when there was a lot more stuff in Brotherhood, in Revelations, in Unity, and everything where there's these large crowds and you're kind of moving in and blending within the crowds. I'm remembering the, I know I'm going off topic. I know that I'm going off topic, but I'm remembering how you would hire groups of courtesans, that like, you know, the prostitutes in Italy at the time, to basically surround you and be dancing and moving around. And then as you came up to near groups of guards, a couple of them would end up being peeled away by the prostitutes and you would just continue on with the rest. It was a really fun little thing that I love seeing that. The other reason for the date that they chose is that Castro believed that most of the soldiers that were stationed at the barracks, even though they were on duty, they were probably going to be drunk, which made sense. You know,
I mean, from what you described,
there was a lot less control on alcohol at this time.
And apparently cocaine and everything else.
Especially with Batiste's regime. Absolutely. Yeah. So he believed that a lot of the soldiers were going to end up being passed out in the barracks, just drunk. And they would have partied hard all the previous night. So a surprise attack during the day when they were either still drunk or severely hungover. Smart plan. Smart plan.
What about mid-partying?
Well, you never know if they still were. Some of them are probably passed out drunk from the previous night. Others might be in the middle of partying or drinking. You don't know. So while his plan was at this time very loosely made, his experience, or inexperience rather, caused Castro to make some rookie mistakes at the beginning. He should have put a man out in front of the barracks for days prior to monitor and record the guards' movements and their patrol patterns so he would have known what it is that he was walking into. But he thought that his plan would just work. He didn't realize that he would need more intel before attempting the attack. And even if he did have more intel, there's this old military saying that I'm sure that anyone who is listening to this can probably really appreciate. No good plan survives first contact with the enemy. And that's reality. It doesn't matter how much you plan out. The moment that something actually happens, all of your plans can go to shit. Hell, we experience that all the time when we're traveling.
I'm thinking that if I were a tactician, I personally would also choreograph the enemy's actions. So we just have no surprises. Thank you. I will mail them my plan. So they, with their choreography. So they know what to expect.
Oh, so you're not sending something that is false information to have them plan something and then you counter that plan that was fake. You're just giving them your straight up plans. Yeah,
and it ends with like a coin toss where we choose who wins that way. Obviously, I would bring a fake like trick coin, so I win.
Oh,
but I won't tell them that
part wasn't included.
Yeah, I'm not going to tell them that part. So that's how I always win, right? Do you like it?
Oh, yes, I love it.
Do I have like a Genghis, what was it? Subutai level of military tactician?
Oh, yeah, totally. No, believe it or not, what you said there at the end is remarkably effective because you've effectively, by that point, leaked false intel because it's everything that is true and it will line up perfectly so that they think that it's real. And then at the last second, there's something that's fake that completely changes everything. So technically speaking, you did come up with a terrible, but at the end, valid military plan.
Okay, guys, call me for any military tactic need, like all of your military tactic needs.
Oh, my God.
I'll do it for free, just for funsies.
Oh, my Lord. Yeah. See, like So what ended up happening, right, is that for Castro and his men, while they were trying to sneak into the barracks, they came across a few guards on patrol. They should be some of the worst guards, but they were apparently some of the most competent guards instead, right? Which from a personal experience when talking about this, like when we've seen being a soldier on guard duty or like just being a security guard or just having to stand out in front of something and just watch people enter and leave out of something, it is mind-numbingly boring. And it's very easy for these individuals, for anyone who's in the military that can probably understand this. It's very easy to get complacent, lazy, or just straight up sleep through part of your shift, even though you're not supposed to. And in many places, if you get busted for doing that, you can be straight up court-martialed or in older days, executed.
For falling asleep on guard duty?
Oh, yeah, because you put everyone's life in danger.
I think we made like a video about that once where you were like, oh, if you fell asleep on guard duty, did you get shot? But I think it was decimated.
Yeah. And so somehow these barracks were being patrolled by people that were freaking amazing and immediately went and captured and shut down the rebels. But before they could even get into the building, mind you, this was a abject failure outright. So why is it fondly remembered by the Cubans, you may ask? Because this was when everything regarding the Cuban Revolution would begin to swing into motion. It was a snowball being pushed down the top of a mountain, building snow until it became an avalanche. But before that avalanche, Castro and all of his men, along with 2 women, ended up getting captured, and half of the nearly 140 soldiers were straight up executed. And the rest of them were thrown in jail awaiting prosecution.
They executed that many people.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No,
That's like 70 men.
Yes. Batiste regime was horribly brutal. And the thing is, we're talking about
all
this stuff.
How can you be horribly corrupt and also horribly... Well, I guess in order to stay in power when you're horribly corrupt,
yeah, if you fight against us, you will die. Yeah.
Oh, wow. That's 70 people.
Yeah. I mean, effectively at the time, it was a rebel group that tried to take over a military installation. Yeah, they were executed. Yeah. So you may then ask, okay, what do they do with Castro? They let the man who's trying to overthrow the government not only defend himself in court, but then they let it be reported what it is that he says during court.
Okay, I'm really curious. So you said he grew up upper, like middle class.
Yes.
He was wealthy.
Yep.
Was he still wealthy at this point? Is that why he got this treatment? Because ideally, if you're going to execute 70 people, you'd execute the leader.
Truthfully, I don't know. I'm not sure necessarily as to why he would have been treated as he was. It's also possible that he wasn't one of the people immediately in the beginning that was storming the barracks. And so that means that since he didn't take place in the immediate violent action, that he was not executed.
Still, you always execute the leader. That's like
I don't think that they
a
knew
rebellion 101.
precisely that he was a leader yet. Some of the information surely had to have been kept hidden.
I'm just wondering if he was super mega wealthy still, maybe that.
It also could factor in. It very well could.
You can't just kill one of the wealthy people on the island's kid.
Yeah.
Look bad. The optics.
Exactly. So again, the court lets him speak. Other people didn't get that option. But not only do they let him speak, they record what it is that he's saying, and that gets disseminated.
Oh, they screwed themselves. Wasn't he like a great speaker?
Freaking great speaker. Big order. Big popular figure. Yeah. One thing that has not been mentioned yet here, because we talk about him speaking, is that Castro is arguably one of history's biggest writers for what he did. That's plainly obvious to anyone who has seen any of his writings or speeches. And you don't have to agree with him at all to still acknowledge that he was a voracious writer and very good speaker that was able to rise up the masses. Castro, even though he was very sick at the time, held a masterclass in political discourse with this sudden public stage that he was given. And oh boy, would he speak it. In what would become later known as one of his greatest speeches ever, he would invoke the names and memories of Antonio Maceo and Jose Marti. Like those guys that we talked about at the very beginning, yes, he was going to reference them. He was going to speak directly into the hearts, the patriotic hearts of every single Cuban that was listening. He put forth the defense that because he was a candidate in the free elections and that Batista's takeover had canceled those elections, that this was in fact not something that was just an uprising. This was a righteous rebellion, something to bring back the 1940 Constitution. And so when asked who was responsible for the attack, Castro replied that, quote, "The intellectual author of this revolution is Jose Marti, the apostle of our independence." He mentioned the 600,000 Cubans that were unemployed. He put forth a 5-point plan detailing the righteousness of his cause, which he called the 5 revolutionary laws. And it's much easier, though, to just read a small passage of his speech to understand just how incredible he was at speaking to the Cuban people and their sense of justice, which they had lacked for so long. He would state at the end of his speech the following, quote, "I come to the close of my defense plea, but I will not end it as lawyers usually do, asking that the accused be freed. I cannot ask for freedom for myself while my comrades are already suffering in the ignominious prison in the Isle of Pines. Send me there to join them to share their fate. It is understandable that honest men should be dead or in prison in a republic where the president is a criminal and a thief. I know that imprisonment will be harder for me than it has been for anyone, filled with cowardly threats and hideous cruelty. But I do not fear prison, as I do not fear the fury of the miserable tyrant who took the lives of 70 of my comrades. Condemn me. It does not matter. History will absolve me." which is a little bit of a mic drop.
He
moment.
went in. He just said the leader is a thief.
Mm-hmm. And what the Batista government didn't know at the time was that that wasn't just something that he just said. He had memorized this entire speech and would later publish it from memory. And what they didn't know was that this moment in this trial would cause Castro to become known far and wide across Cuba. This is what would cause people to start listening to what he had to say in greater numbers, more than ever before. And if they knew, chances are they would have just executed him on the spot. Anyone would when realizing just how dangerous the man that was in their custody was to an authoritarian regime. So, of course, the court then disregards most of what Castro says in his defense. It literally doesn't matter, but it's enough to spare his life. So instead of just outright executing him, they instead sentence him to 15 years in prison, which, considering the prisons at the time, he's more than likely to just die in that anyway. So it basically is a death sentence. It really is. And in a true testament to his resourcefulness, Castro decides that if his people are going to be stuck in one location, well, all the better. So he begins to read like a madman. Doesn't matter if it is Marx, if it is Shakespeare, if it is Darwin, Kafka, Hemingway, the Greek, Roman philosophers, anything and everything, he reads all of it. His favorite book was For Whom the Bell Tolls. He is learning how to speak, how to inspire. He recruits more soldiers among the prisoners of the place where he is because he is organizing all of them too. Yeah, you can probably see where it is that this is going. Funny little detail then, or I guess funny little detail, moving on when talking about him, Castro at this point had been married in 1948 to a person by the name of Marta Diaz-Balart, and her family had approved of what Fidel Castro had been doing as a young politician, but now he was a revolutionary. So what really threw Castro into a rage was when it was reported that Marta had accepted not only government assistance for her and her son, Fidelito, she had taken a job in the government that her husband was trying to overthrow. And that little detail, which I guess is kind of funny, ended up causing Fidel to go basically thermonuclear. He lost his shit to a level that was uncommon with him. It was a greater insult to him that his wife was a tool of the regime that he was fighting than if she had just had an affair. And I'm not being dramatic with that. It was close to word for word what he would say at the time, that it was a cowardly insult. Castro would be a little dramatic when he was incensed, and that was absolutely what he felt. This was the straw that broke the camel's back, which is also a weird way to phrase it, considering that he had already tried to overthrow the government once. But this, no, for his family, that was the final straw, that she took a job with the government. So he filed for divorce at the soonest opportunity that he could.
Oh, wow. I was looking for a picture of her. Couldn't find one in.
No, honestly, I would believe that if that was such a huge mark of shame, that he would want to scrub all of that from his past. Eventually, Batista comes under pressure from the general public. People are not happy. And in order to appease them, what he does is that he tries to start releasing political prisoners to, make things calm down. He releases Fidel and his rebels. And within 6 months, Fidel and his brother Raul go and move to Mexico, and they form an army. Just a little bit of a backfire, right? So they go and meet other rebels there, and more Cubans begin to arrive as they're fleeing Batista's regime, and they start to swell their ranks. This includes a young Argentine doctor by the name of Ernesto Guevara, and the men start to notice a difference in his Argentine slang. Because in Mexico and many other countries, the use of the word güey, this is a substitute for the word dude or bro, or even just like, hey, like sup. But in the dialects of Spanish, they begin to change further as you head down to the Americas. And so güey becomes che. So because he was always then saying, che, check it out, or che, listen up. Things like that, like for the Cubans, they quickly began to refer to him as che. So this is where you get the guy who would become Che Guevara. There you go. Yes. So Che and Castro become something that is, I mean, they're more than friends. They are brothers at this point.
I did not know that. They were close.
Yeah,
I mean, it makes a lot of sense that they were, but I don't know.
A lot of the revolutionaries at this time are very closely tied to one another. They were basically on the same wavelength as one another. And Che would become a commander of a whole column, even though he was a medic. He wasn't a fighter. He was a medic, which in military circles is unheard of unless you are specifically in a medical unit. And so according to Castro, Che would attempt to climb a small mountain near Mexico City every morning while they trained there. He was a guy who was, he suffered from asthma for his entire life. And so he would try and fail to reach the peak before having to give up and go back down to rest. And he would do this every single day, and he never reached the peak. Castro surmised that the story was a good indicator of the character of Che. He knew that he might not make it, but he was determined to keep trying again and again and again and again and again, no matter how many times it was that he was going to fail. Which, by the way, if you ever want to see a great film about young Che Guevara, I'm just saying this right now, and how he developed his ideology and how that changed, check out something called The Motorcycle Diaries. It's fascinating. It's also this interesting little detail that around this time, all of the revolutionaries led by Castro began to support beards. And that wasn't because of a PR effort. That wasn't anything necessarily intentional. It was straight up, hey guys, we don't have any razors. We're off in the middle of Mexico in this spot where there really isn't much in the way of infrastructure. There's no barber. There's no anything that we can utilize. So we don't have any straight razors that we can use. So they all just start growing beards. And as time goes on, that becomes the revolutionary look. So when you see Castro or the image of Che Guevara with with the beards, like and all of that. I mean, actually, wait, Che was usually depicted with a beard? No, he's not. Che is usually depicted clean shaven, but the classic look of Castro in a beard, that's where that comes from, is specifically that. So yeah.
Che Guevara had a beard.
Okay, so at the time he did thin, but it's there. It's there.
You don't have to roast the man's beard.
Yeah, I can.
Look, there's a better one. Better beard.
Let me see. Okay,
Not everyone can grow your level of facial hair.
Yeah.
That was elitist.
It's also weird that people are probably looking at this right now. For anyone watching YouTube, my beard is not big. It has just been trimmed. This is finely trimmed in comparison to what it usually is. I can grow a beard.
Okay, so can I. I think I haven't tried, but if I tried, maybe I could.
Okay. So yeah, they grow beards, and at the time it catches on in the revolutionary look, and so Cuban men start to grow beards going in the late 50s. That's just a big thing.
Was that just a sign of the revolution? Like this is how they showed they supported it?
Yeah, it kind of becomes just a popular thing for them. Like it was a sign of manliness, of revolutionary freedom. Like that was what you were supposed to do.
So when do they leave Mexico? Because I'm assuming they leave Mexico and then they win and then they run the country, right?
Well, they're there for a bit.
And then the Cold War happens.
They're in there for a couple years because they need training. They need to prepare themselves. But after a couple years, they're ready. So they need transport for the 1,200-mile trip to Cuba, and that's going to be a little bit difficult. They try to go and purchase a military vehicle with no luck, and so they have to settle for this old, broken-down 43-foot yacht named the Granma, which was meant to hold, I kid you not, no more than 20 people comfortably, and that is it. It is named after the original owner's grandmother, and this had to have been one of the least impressive warships in all of history. And really, it seems like a racist joke when we talk about Cubans today and having fled from Cuba in massive rafts that are overcrowded. The story of Castro taking Cuba is basically in a massive oversized craft that should fit no more than 20 people, and he fits 80 men and 2 women onto that. A good 400% of what it's supposed to.
Wow.
Yeah. They also happened to choose a terrible time to travel, as this was hurricane season. Yeah. And they faced
hurricane season in a broken down 43-foot yacht that is overfilled by at least 4 times the amount of people that should be on it.
Yep.
But they made it. Yay.
Yep. Yeah. So they face a lot of storms. They face rough seas. The boat is basically falling apart. The engine doesn't run well. And it's somewhere on the boat, there's a crack and it is filling up with water. That is something that is happening. And so they are constantly having to bail out water. It is supposed to only take them 5 days to get there, but it ends up taking 7. One man ended up falling overboard during this time. And even though it did cost them hours, Castro refused to leave the man behind, and eventually they do actually succeed in rescuing him. He was very adamant about this at this point in time.
How did he not drown? Did they throw him out alive?
No, I think they circled back and they continuously were trying to get him up, and it took several hours to do, but they got it.
If it was choppy and he was in the water, how did he survive?
He just did. He fought. You can last for a while. It's just hard, especially fighting the waves.
You're not supposed to basically you shouldn't tread water in that. You should just float and then bob up when you need to breathe.
Yeah.
That's what I always do when I'm caught out at sea.
Yeah. In a hurricane. Yeah. It's just a usual Tuesday for you. Absolutely.
Happens.
So, but either way, they do make it and they land in the southeastern part of Cuba near Santiago de Cuba. So they do this. Batista had predicted that this was going to happen. He knew that they were going to be arriving, and almost immediately the men get pinned down on the beach in the open and vulnerable, getting attacked not just by regular soldiers, but planes and helicopters. Right? This is a modern war, if anything. Castro then gives the order to disperse and hide among the sugarcane fields. And the next thing that he knew, Fidel Castro was hiding in a sugar field with 2 men left, and that is it. One of whom had lost his rifle. He didn't have his weapon. These 2 men would later become iconic in the memory of the Cuban people, as they were considered to be the prime example of loyalty, seemingly to the end. As one of them happened to be Castro's personal bodyguard, which was fortunate because Fidel, he was not in a good state. He was doubting himself at this point. He was worried that things were not going to go well. He was not making good decisions, and seemingly out of nowhere would say things like, "We have already won the revolution," which is not the case, because he was literally hiding under mats of sugarcane leaves for hours, just whispering with his men. He seemed outright like he was going crazy, and this was easily the lowest point of the Cuban Revolution. And you could have said, if things had gone even slightly differently, it could have ended there outright, and that's it. With 3 guys in a sugar field, 2 rifles, and 120 rounds of ammunition. That's all that he had at this point. For all Castro knew, that is all that he had left, because he had lost communication with the rest of his forces. But somehow, Castro and his men, moving under the cover of darkness, do manage to get away. They do survive. They make it to the mountains, where they manage to find some friendly local supporters. And over 3 brutal days on the run, hiding constantly on the ground from patrols, from these ground patrols that are moving by. They have planes and helicopters going searching for them. They manage to get away. He sleeps with his rifle tucked in between his legs and the rifle muzzle situated right next to his chin, because he refuses to be taken alive, so that if anyone grabs him in his sleep, he can very quickly pull the trigger and blow his brains out. He is not wanting to be captured. Not again. He refused to be taken alive. But once to safety, they waited. And after 2 weeks, Raul and more men would show up with 5 more guns. And then Che would return with more men and weapons as well. And now Castro starts to believe that he can breathe again. And he states, now we can win the war.
You know, it's nice. It's not nice, but it's good to know that even brilliantly brave people cave under pressure.
Oh yeah, absolutely. He was going crazy at this time. He's young still too. Like, this is what? This is 1958? This is 1958. He was born in 1926. He's 32 years old.
Yeah, so it's just nice to know. I mean, I cave under pressure going to the grocery store, but I can apply it.
For the Cuban Revolution. So he has more men, but it's not too many. They had almost 30 men at this point, which is still a significant number. And from here, they can start planning ambushes.
There was the 82 people that left. Only 2 remained.
They scattered. But they're not dead necessarily. They scattered. So they're not in communication with one another. They don't have a set point that they're meeting up at because they all just pretty much had to flee because they, again, got pinned down on the beaches and had to scatter into the wild. A number of them may be dead. They don't know at this point. But after, 2 weeks here, they get those 30 people that have gathered up. So, okay, you got Castro, you got 30 men, and here is a decent amount so we can start organizing ambushes. So utilizing guerrilla warfare tactics, they start disrupting the enemy and they begin winning fights. In their first 2 fights, they suffered 0 casualties. No dead, no wounded, nothing. In later fights, they would end up suffering some losses, but it should be noted here that when they did this, they always would try to treat captured enemy combatants first, which is hardly something that you would expect a heartless dictator to do. But it's important to note that Castro's men at this time, they weren't terrorists as much as people would try to frame them as. They were under strict orders to not torture, not to assassinate enemies, or allow civilian victims. They were only ambushing these military patrols. They were very particular with what they were doing. And so over time, they continued to weaken Batista's position, and public opinion would gradually turn into their favor. New weapons were being recovered from Batista's men, but also a lot of the Cubans, the longer that they were there, the more people would end up joining the cause. By the late 1958, the general population was strongly in support of Castro, and the 26th of July movement, as he would name the revolution, was growing. Batista's staff would organize peace talks because they just couldn't take it anymore. And over the course of the meeting, it was agreed that Castro would take control of Cuba in exchange for the life of Batista and his top supporters, because they knew they were not going to be able to win against the people. And so on January 1st, 1959, Fidel Castro and the 26th of July movement obtains control of Cuba and begins the rather difficult process of trying to sort out a government and a society and everything that happens when, you have a massive, messy war. And what a lot of people don't know here is that Castro going into this, his original goal was not actually to just take over the government. He wasn't trying to be the top official in all of that. No, he wanted power to be able to affect things. He wanted some power, but he didn't want to be the guy who was up there. Initially. We always have to say initially when it comes to these kinds of things. He chose a magistrate by the name of Manuel Urita, who had acquitted members of the movement in 1957. And this was a guy who was considered to be a good, upstanding Christian. Urita would he would get the position of being president. And a month later, Castro was made prime minister, when the existing prime minister, Jose Miró Cardona, would just suddenly resign and defect. And while Urrutia was doing things that pissed off a number of Cubans, like closing brothels, the gambling halls, and shutting down the national lottery, all these things that under Batista, I'm not going to say that it's a problem that these things exist, right? But the level that they did was so incredibly high that it was creating massive problems in society. And so when he starts closing down all of this, good Christian guy that he is, and not wanting this den of corruption to exist, it pisses off a lot of Cubans. But Castro is fervently supporting him at this time. He is making sure that he has the support necessary to be the face of what's going on in society. And simultaneously, he is making sure that the prime minister position has just as much, or if not just as much, around the same level of power as the president do, so that he can initiate some changes. And when he hears that Urrutia starts doing something not upstanding or Christian, he buys a lavish villa for himself.
I don't think it's not upstanding or Christian, but if they were fighting corruption and they were fighting the wealth distribution that was less than ideal for the majority of the people.
The reason I bring that up is because that was like his whole point, is that he was this individual. That's why I'm saying that.
Yeah, but I think it was the fact that he bought the lavish mansion, because that is a slippery slope right back to corruption.
Oh, exactly. So yeah, he gets this lavish villa while the peasants are struggling not to starve. And this, in conjunction with anti-communist statements, quickly caused Castro to lose faith in him.
Okay, so he now is like, okay, guys, I think we've taken over. Time for me to get all the money.
No,
not Castro. I'm talking about
Urrutia.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that's kind of what ends up happening with him. But another guy would actually end up coming into charge after him, not Castro. Because
why won't Castro just take power? This was his whole idea.
Well, you'll see. Because on the 17th of July, 1959, Conrado Becker, who was a sugarcane workers leader, demanded Urrutia's resignation. Castro himself would actually resign as prime minister of Cuba in protest. But later on that day, he would appear on television to deliver a lengthy denouncement of Urrutia, claiming that he had complicated the government and that his fervent anti-communism was having a detrimental effect. Castro's sentiments received widespread support as organized crowds surrounded the presidential palace, demanding that Urrutia resign, which was duly received. And so on the 23rd of July, Castro would resume his position as premier and would appoint Osvaldo Dorticos. He would promote this guy as the new president. And Dorticos was perfect for Cuba in Castro's eyes. Do you know why?
Why?
Because he would do what Castro said.
Okay, so Castro wanted a figurehead.
Yeah, pretty much, yeah.
You know how in the Caribbean, like, president is more of like, at least in Trinidad, the president is like a figurehead. They have official stuff. And then the prime minister has all the, it's giving that.
Effectively. So what would happen here in this case is Dortico was an individual that he knew how Castro thought and could represent Castro's interest on the world stage. And that would allow Castro to focus more on rebuilding Cuba itself. And eventually, Castro would become the leader of the Communist Party in Cuba, the top authority in the land, regardless of the title. That did not matter. And it's at this point that we need to remember that the Cuban Revolution did not happen in a vacuum, right? This is the Cold War that is just beginning. And the United States, Soviet Union were incredibly suspicious of one another and their intentions. The USSR, up to this point, had really no interest in Latin America. It was small, it was poor, it was in America's backyard. There is no reason to try and instigate a revolution in a place that is going to create a state that they're not going to be able to have much influence over and not have much impact. Like, there's no real geopolitical reason as to why they would want communist revolutions there, or why they would instigate them, rather. But when a small band of rebels with a strong leader overthrows a regime that was installed by the United States, you better believe that they noticed. They knew that this happened. For when Castro first appeared on the world stage, he had their curiosity. Yes, but now he had their attention.
You're just quoting movies.
Yes, of course I am. The US, on the other hand, was against Castro from the start. They did not like him. They put a perfectly good, corrupt crony in power that would do what they said. And now Castro had the balls to go in and remove him. Yeah, no, he did. That simply wouldn't do. That simply wouldn't do. So the CIA then goes in and begins a campaign to try and bring him down. And we are going to get to that more in a bit. But it wouldn't be a history show if we didn't touch on two things that happened with, the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Cuban Missile Crisis and all that beautiful, 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 horrible stuff going into the Cold War.
And the multiple assassination attempts, which is, it's going to be something.
But that's something that I think we're going to cover next time. Because honestly, looking at this point, we've been recording this for what? I'm even going to look at the audio right now. Oh, yeah. An hour and 38 minutes, which if you cut off any of the silent parts of anything we had while I had to drink water, still probably an hour and a half. And we're halfway through this thing. Yeah, this is definitely a part 1, part 2 scenario.
So make sure to come back next week.
Exactly.
Part 2.
For those of you who are watching this on YouTube, thank you very much. I ask that you like, comment, and subscribe. Do everything you can to support these videos and the algorithm. I really hope that you enjoyed listening to what it is that we have in here. And for those of you that are listening to this on, say, the like Spotify, on anywhere that you get your podcast, thank you, everyone, all of you. Make sure to click all the links that are down in our description for on both aspects of whatever media that this is. And simultaneously, make sure to leave us a review if you can, because every review really does help us get pushed within the algorithm of Apple and Spotify and everything else. All right, before we go, it's time for our family history. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this, perhaps who are seeing this on YouTube for the first time, every week what we do after the episode is we read off a family history or story from one of our listeners. So in this case, we have an email that says, "Dear Stakuyi and Gabby, love the podcast and have listened to every episode since stumbling upon it. My girlfriend and I immediately find an episode to listen to whenever we're in the car." Hey, thank you. I appreciate it. My family history is more of asking for a favor. Frank Littlejohn, better known to me as my grandfather was a rat of Tobruk. Rats of Tobruk were soldiers of the Australian-led Allied garrison that held the Libyan port of Tobruk against the Afrika Korps during the siege of Tobruk in World War II. Oh yeah, no, the Rats of Tobruk, that's a whole thing. The siege started on the 11th of April, 1941, and was relieved on the 10th of December. The port continued to be held by the Allies until it surrendered on the 21st of June, 1942. Win-win. Grandpa, surviving the war, thankfully, and upon returning to Australia as a reward for his efforts as a returned soldier, was promised farmland, which he received outside of Numurkah. There we go. Not where he had been promised, but nonetheless took. Thankfully, meeting my grandmother and having 5 children, more than 20 grandchildren, and oh man, so many great-grandchildren, he passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1997. Many of my family are avid historians and hunters of the past and are always finding ways to discover family histories and trace lineages. So I thought I would like to see if you all could read this on the show as a potential call to anyone that may have known my grandfather or even fought beside him. Just never know. Have a great rest of your day, and I hope this reaches you well. Sincerely, Fraser Wood. Little John is on my mother's side. Well, Fraser, I really appreciate you for sending that in. And I'll say that again for anyone. Frank Littlejohn is who he's referring to from the Rats of Tobruk. So if anyone recognizes it or has someone or a relative that was, see if you can send us in some info. Anyway, everyone, thank you very much for listening. I hope you have a good rest of your day, and we will see you next time. Goodbye, my friends.
Bye.